It is 2 in the morning. You are not asleep. You know you should be. You have been lying in the dark for an hour or maybe two, and the thoughts are doing what they always do at this hour, cycling, looping, landing on the same fears with the same weight, refusing to stop. So you reach for your phone. You search something you have searched before, and somehow you land on a verse you have heard 100 times, a verse that is stitched on throw pillows and printed on coffee mugs and shared in Instagram graphics with soft watercolor flowers in the background. Do not be anxious about anything. You read it, and for a moment, just a moment, you feel something, a flicker. Maybe this time it will work. Maybe this time you will read it and the chest tightness will ease and the spiral will slow, and you will finally sleep. But it doesn't work. It never quite works. And somewhere under the exhaustion and the fear, a question starts to form. A question you feel guilty for asking. A question that sounds like this: why doesn't this verse actually do anything for me? Stay with me, because I want to tell you something about that verse that almost nobody tells you. Something that changes everything about how it reads, and more importantly, how it works. But first, I need to take you somewhere. I need to take you to a city called Philippi in the Roman province of Macedonia in the year AD 61, a city built on military pride and imperial power, where the streets smell like sacrifice, smoke, and fresh bread, and the boots of soldiers who had served Caesar and retired there to die with honor. And I need to introduce you to a man who is sitting in a Roman prison, probably in chains, awaiting a trial he may not survive. That man is the one who wrote those words. And before this video is over, I want to tell you about one night in that city when the ground actually shook, and what one man did in the middle of it that has never left me. But to understand that night, you need to understand this letter. And to understand this letter, you need to understand the man who wrote it from the bottom of a cell. Because here is the thing about Philippians 4:6. It is not advice from a man who never felt what you are feeling. It is a command from a man who felt all of it and found something on the other side. Here is what the verse actually says in the original Greek. The word translated anxious. The word Paul uses when he says, be anxious about nothing, is merimnao. And when you look at where that word comes from, something shifts. Merimnao is a compound word. It comes from merizo, to divide, to split, to pull apart, and news the mind. So the word that gets translated as anxiety in your English Bible literally means a mind being pulled in two directions at once. That is what anxiety is. Not weakness, not failure, not a spiritual problem to be ashamed of. It is your mind being torn between what is real and what is feared, between what you can control and what you cannot, between what God has promised and what your body is screaming at 3 in the morning. Paul knows this word from the inside. He did not write it as a man who had never been torn. And here is what most people miss. Paul is not writing this verse in a vacuum. He is writing it 4 verses after something very specific. 4 verses before this famous command about anxiety, Paul does something almost no Bible teacher mentions in the same breath. He names 2 women, Euodia and Syntyche. He names them publicly in a letter that will be read aloud to the whole church. And he pleads. The Greek word is parakaleo. It means to urge with deep personal appeal. He pleads with them to be reconciled. These were not minor figures. They were prominent women in the Philippian church, women who had, in Paul's own words, contended at my side in the cause of the gospel. They had been in the trenches with him, and now they were in open conflict with each other, which means the church in Philippi, the church Paul is writing to, has been living with that tension week after week, meeting in someone's home, probably Lydia's home, with the weight of a broken relationship in the room. That is not a theological problem. That is a social anxiety with a face and a name and a history. Paul sees it. He names it. And then, 4 verses later, he writes the most famous line about anxiety in the New Testament. That is not a coincidence. So let's go back to the beginning, not the beginning of the verse, the beginning of Philippi, because you cannot understand what Paul means by peace until you understand what peace cost him in that city the first time he arrived. The year is AD 49. Paul has never been to Europe before. He has had a vision, a man from Macedonia standing on a shore saying, "Come over and help us." And Paul, being Paul, has taken this seriously enough to get on a boat. He arrives in Philippi with 3 people, Silas, Timothy, and a physician named Luke, who begins writing everything down. They look for a synagogue. There isn't one. Not enough Jewish men in the city to form a quorum. So they go to the river, and at the river they find a group of women praying. One of them is named Lydia. She is a merchant, a dealer in purple cloth, which was one of the most expensive commodities in the ancient world. Purple dye came from murex shellfish, crushed by hand, and it took thousands of shells to produce a single pound of dye. The people who wore purple were royalty and senators. Lydia sold to them. She was not poor and she was not powerless. And on a riverbank outside a Roman colony, she listened to Paul, and the text says something remarkable. It says, "The Lord opened her heart." Not that Paul persuaded her, not that the argument was airtight. The Lord opened her heart. She was baptized. Her whole household was baptized. And she turned to Paul and said, essentially, "My house is yours. Come and stay." That is how the Philippian church began. Not in a temple, not in a synagogue, on a riverbank, with a businesswoman who opened her home. And this is where it gets remarkable. Within days, everything goes wrong. Paul and Silas encounter a slave girl, a girl who is being exploited for her ability to predict the future. She follows them through the streets for days, shouting, identifying them as servants of the Most High God. And Paul, grieved by what he sees, commands the spirit to leave her. It leaves. And her owners, men who had been profiting from her suffering, are furious. They drag Paul and Silas to the magistrates. They accuse them of causing trouble, of advocating customs unlawful for Romans. The crowd turns. The magistrates order them stripped and beaten. Luke records it plainly. They were severely flogged, not warned, not fined, flogged, Roman rods in a public square in front of a crowd. And then they were thrown into the inner prison, the maximum security cell, the one reserved for the most dangerous inmates, and their feet were fastened in stocks. This is Paul's introduction to Philippi. Now, here is something you need to hold on to as we move forward. This is the city Paul is writing to when he says, "Do not be anxious about anything." Not a city he has warm, easy memories of. A city where he was publicly humiliated, bleeding, locked in the dark. And yet, Philippians is the most joyful letter Paul ever wrote. He uses the word joy or rejoice 16 times in 4 chapters, 16 times. From a man in chains, writing to a city where he once bled, writing to a church currently divided by conflict, writing to people living under the same Roman pressure that once put him in the stocks. That is not denial. That is not performance. That is something else entirely. The Greek word Paul uses for peace in verse 7 is eirene. You have probably seen it as a name, Irene. It comes from a root that means to join, to weave together what has been broken apart. But Paul is writing to people who also know the Hebrew word, shalom. And shalom does not mean the absence of trouble. Every scholar will tell you this, and it is worth sitting with. Shalom means wholeness in the middle of trouble, integration, a self that is not being pulled apart, even when the circumstances remain exactly as bad as they were. This is not a peace that requires the situation to change. This is a peace that stands guard over you while the situation does whatever it is going to do. And that word, guard, is the most important word in the verse. Paul writes, "The peace of God will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus." The word translated guard is phroureo. It is a military term. It means a sentinel, a soldier stationed at a gate, armed, watching, not a passive state of calm. an active armed presence standing between you and whatever is trying to get in. Paul is not saying you will feel peaceful. He is saying peace will stand post at the door of your mind, and it will not let the worst in without a fight. Pay attention to this, because that changes the entire ask. So what does Paul actually command? He does not say, stop feeling anxious. He cannot command your nervous system. He cannot reach through a 2,000-year-old letter and turn off the cortisol and slow the heart rate and quiet the catastrophizing. Nobody can, and Paul, who is a remarkably practical man, knows this. What he commands is a redirect. He writes, in every situation, by prayer and petition with thanksgiving, present your requests to God. Look at that structure. In every situation, not in calm situations, not in situations where prayer feels natural and your faith is strong and the morning light is coming through a clean window. Every situation, including 2 in the morning, including the diagnosis, including the conversation that went wrong and won't leave your head, including the thing you are afraid to say out loud because saying it out loud makes it feel more real. Every situation, by prayer and petition, 2 different words. Prosuche is general prayer, the ongoing conversation with God, the posture of a person whose life is oriented toward Him. Diesis is petition, specific, urgent, particular asking. Bring both, the broad and the sharp, the habit, the desperate cry. With thanksgiving. This is the part that stops people, because when you are in the middle of anxiety, real anxiety, the kind that wakes you at 3 in the morning and sits on your chest, thanksgiving feels impossible. It feels dishonest. It feels like being told to smile at a funeral. But Paul is not asking you to be grateful that things are bad. He is asking you to be grateful that you are not approaching this alone. Thanksgiving, in this context, is the acknowledgement. There is a God who is already here. There is a God who has been in this room longer than the fear has. There is a history of being held that does not disappear because tonight is hard. That is all. Just that. Present your requests to God. Lay them out. Say them. The thing you want, the thing you are afraid of, the thing you are ashamed to admit wanting because it feels too small or too large or too unlikely. Say it. Not because God does not know. He does. But because the act of bringing it out of your head and placing it somewhere outside yourself is, neurologically and spiritually, one of the most important things a human being can do. The anxiety lives in the loop. The prayer breaks the loop. Here is what Epaphroditus can teach us about this. He is not the most famous person in the New Testament. He gets a paragraph in Philippians, but that paragraph is extraordinary. Paul says that Epaphroditus was sent to him by the Philippians, sent to bring a gift, sent to care for Paul in his imprisonment. And then Paul says something quietly devastating. Epaphroditus nearly died. He was so ill. The Greek word is paraboleuomai, to expose oneself to danger, to gamble with one's life. That the Philippians heard he was sick and were anxious. And he knew they were anxious, and that made him more distressed. He was sick, far from home, watching Paul in chains, and worried about people who were worried about him. He was, in every human sense, overwhelmed, and yet Paul sends him back to Philippi with a letter full of joy. Not because Epaphroditus had figured out how to not feel things, but because the community of faith, imperfect, conflicted, exhausted, anxious, was the place where people handed the unbearable to each other and to God. That is the ecosystem Philippians 4:6 lives in, not a self-help formula. A community, a letter, a man nearly dead who is being sent home with words that say, take this back to them. Tell them I am at peace. Tell them what peace actually is. Now let's talk about the command itself one more time. Do not be anxious about anything. People hear this and feel accused, condemned, as if Paul is saying, you should not feel this way, and the fact that you do means something is wrong with you. That is not what he is saying. He is saying, do not let the anxiety be the end of the sentence. Merim now, The mind being torn in two directions is the beginning of the verse, not the point of it. The command is not arrive at a state of no anxiety. The command is when the tearing starts, do something specific with it. Redirect. Bring it. Every single piece of it. The catastrophic thought, the specific fear, the thing that makes no logical sense but will not stop. The grief underneath the anxiety, because there is almost always grief underneath the anxiety, and pretending otherwise is not faith, it is avoidance. Bring all of it. And then, the peace of God which surpasses understanding, which cannot be explained in terms of your circumstances or your logic or your mental state, will stand guard. Here's the part nobody tells you. Paul does not promise the peace will arrive before you pray. He says it comes after. The peace is not the condition for the prayer. The peace is the result. You do not have to feel peaceful to begin. You just have to begin. Now I want to tell you about the night the earth shook in Philippi. We have been building toward it. We had to build toward it. Because if I had started there, you would have heard a Bible story you already know, but you have been somewhere else with me. You have been in a prison cell in Rome where a man in chains is writing a letter about peace. You have been at a riverside where a businesswoman opened her heart and her home. You have been with a young man named Epaphroditus who gambled his life to carry a gift. Now go back. Go back to that first night when Paul and Silas were in the inner prison with their feet in the stocks. It is midnight. They have been flogged in public. Their backs are torn. Their wrists are bleeding or bruised from chains. They are in the innermost cell, which, according to Roman prison records and the accounts of Pliny the Younger, describing provincial prisons of this era, would have been underground or nearly so. No windows, no light, damp. The smell of rot and waste and fear. They are not in a chapel. They are not at a prayer meeting. They are in the worst room in the worst building in a city that just decided they are its enemies. And they are singing. Luke records it with almost no commentary, because Luke is a physician who writes like a physician, precise, spare, trusting the facts to carry the weight. He simply says, about midnight, Paul and Silas were praying and singing hymns to God, and the other prisoners were listening. The other prisoners were listening. Think about what that means. These are men in chains who have heard everything in that cell. Men who have heard screaming. Men who have heard bargaining. Men who have heard the silence of someone who has given up. They have heard every sound a human being makes when they are stripped of hope. They have not heard this. They have not heard men who have every reason to despair, choosing at midnight to sing, and then the ground moves. The text says the foundations of the prison were shaken. Every door flew open. Every chain fell loose. Every prisoner was free. This is the moment. This is the moment the jailer wakes up. He sees the doors open, and he draws his sword. Because here is what you need to know about a Roman jailer in a colonial prison. He is responsible with his life for the lives of his prisoners. If they escape, he dies in their place. That is not metaphor. That is Roman law. And so when he sees the doors open and the darkness inside, and assumes, rationally in that situation, assumes that everyone is gone, he does what a man does when the worst has already happened and there is nothing left to lose. He lifts the sword toward himself, and a voice comes out of the darkness. Don't harm yourself. We are all here, Paul. Paul, who has just had every chain fall from his wrists. Paul, who could be walking out of that door into the Macedonian night and never looking back. Paul, who is standing in the pitch dark with a singing torn throat and a flogged back and years of imprisonment still ahead of him, calls out to a man who was about to end his life. We are all here. The jailer calls for lights, he rushes in, and the text says he fell trembling before Paul and Silas. And then he asked the most important question in the story. What must I do to be saved? He does not ask. What happened tonight? He does not ask. Why are you still here? He does not ask, who are you? He asks what to do. Because something in what he witnessed, The singing at midnight, the earthquake, and most of all, the man who stayed, told him that whatever these people have, he needs it. He needs it more than escape. He needs it more than his own freedom. There is a Josephus passage that I keep coming back to when I think about this story. In his Jewish Antiquities, Josephus writes about a pattern he observed in people who maintained faith under Roman imprisonment, that they spoke and sang, not as if they hoped to escape, but as if they were already somewhere else, already elsewhere, already held. That is what the other prisoners heard that night. Not men pretending things were fine. Not men in denial about the stocks and the blood and the dark. Men who were already somewhere else. What must I do to be saved? That is the question hanging in the air of a broken open prison at midnight in a Roman colony. And Paul answers it. And then, this is the part of the story that gets me every time. The jailer takes Paul and Silas out of the prison. Into his own house, he washes their wounds, his family hears the message, his entire household is baptized that night, in the middle of the night, after an earthquake, after a near suicide, after chains falling and doors flying open, and a man falling on his knees in the dark. All of this, and then the text says the jailer brought them food. He sat with them, and he and his whole household. This man who had been their captor, who had locked them in the worst cell, who had put their feet in the stocks, they rejoiced together. That word in the Greek is agalio. It means an exuberant, uncontained joy, the kind that does not make logical sense given the circumstances, the kind that comes from somewhere deeper than circumstance. The peace of God, which surpasses understanding, not the absence of the worst night of your life, standing guard in the middle of it now. Open loop resolved. That old man writing from Rome, the one whose feet had been in those stocks, whose back carried scars from that public square, that is the man who tells you not to be anxious. Not because anxiety is a sign of weakness, not because your fear is illegitimate, but because he has been in the midnight of it and found that something else was also there. He is not writing from a therapy office or a mountaintop. He is writing from chains, and he is writing, I have learned in whatever state I am to be content. Learned, past tense, process, not a gift that arrived fully formed. A discipline acquired in cells and shipwrecks and floggings and broken friendships and near-death experiences. And one night in Philippi, when the earth shook and everything fell open and he chose to stay. He chose to stay. That is what this verse is. Not a magic spell, not a demand to perform emotional health you do not have. It is a record of a choice made by a man with every reason not to make it, and an invitation to make it yourself. Here is what I want you to carry out of this video. 3 things, just 3. The first, the command in Philippians 4:6 is not stop feeling anxious. It is redirect. When the mind starts tearing in 2 directions, and it will, because you are human and the world is hard, Paul is not asking you to arrive at peace before you pray. He is asking you to pray first, specifically, with every jagged piece of it laid out, and trust that the peace comes after, not before after. The second, the peace God promises is not the absence of your worst night. It is a guard, frurio, a soldier posted at the gate of your mind, standing between you and the worst your thoughts can do. That peace does not require the situation to resolve. It stands post while the situation does whatever it is going to do. You are not waiting for circumstances to change before you are allowed to be held. You are held now. And the third, the one I want to land last because I think it is the one you most need to hear. Paul had no reason to be at peace. By every measurable standard, by the logic of his circumstances, by the evidence of his suffering, by the trajectory of a man in chains awaiting trial before Nero, he had no reason to be at peace. He chose it anyway, not because he felt it first, not because everything got better, not because the prison doors opened. They did open, and he stayed. Because he had found something that the earthquake could not shake loose. and the stocks could not hold, and the chains could not contain. You are reading this verse at 2 in the morning, or maybe in a waiting room, or maybe in the particular silence of a life that has gotten very heavy, and the man who wrote it is not standing at a comfortable distance handing you a principle. He is in the cell with you. He is singing. If this video has done anything for you, if any piece of it has landed differently than the last time you read that verse on a throw pillow, I want to ask you to do one thing before you close the tab. Not share the video, not like it, not subscribe. Though if you want to see more of this kind of content, the subscribe button is right there, and it means more than you know. One thing, write down the specific thing, the specific fear, the specific outcome you are dreading, the specific name of the thing that is pulling your mind in two directions at midnight. Write it. Physically, on paper or in a note on your phone. Write it as a request, not a journal entry, not a complaint, a request, and bring it. That is all Paul is asking. That is the entire command. Bring the specific thing with thanks for the God who is already in the room, and trust that the guard will stand post. You do not have to feel ready. You just have to begin. If you want to go deeper into Paul's letter to the Philippians, the next video in this series looks at the verse that comes just before this one. The verse where Paul says the Lord is near. 2 words. Some scholars think he means Jesus is coming back soon. Others think he means Jesus is standing close right now. The difference matters more than you might think. That video is up next. And if you are new here, welcome. This channel exists for one reason: to take the Bible seriously enough to look at what it actually says, where it was actually written, and why it still matters at 2 in the morning. My name is on the channel. I am glad you are here.